Okay, so we are starting the World War One study guide today. And obviously, you found the screencast to watch, and you're also going to need to make sure you open the study guide and make a copy of it so that you can type on it. If you still are a little unsure about how to do that, click File and make a copy. Okay, if you have not been doing this, then you're probably having a hard time getting things turned in correctly. All you need to do is make a copy, put it in your Google Drive. It automatically goes in there. I would not share it with anyone at this point, but hit OK and you will have your own copy to type on. If you prefer writing on the study guide, then you will have to have a printer to print it out with. And then, yes, you can handwrite however you want. Then you'll have to make sure you take a picture of your study guide to turn in each page of the study guide, and that'll get submitted in Schoology. All right. So let me help you out with some of this study guide by going through each part, and I'm going to show you a couple video clips and I'll show you some answers in the textbook to help you get started. Okay, so first thing it wants to know, who are the Central Powers and who are the Allied Powers? You probably know this by now. I'm going to give you each of these boxes. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire are your Central Powers. And then the Allied, the three big ones, Russia, France, and Great Britain, or the United Kingdom. Now, the Allied powers are the ones that we joined the war to fight with. So we were fighting against the Central Powers up here. If you need to, you can pause the screencast and write those down or type them in. And then we get to, what is trench warfare? The textbook has this on 722. So let's take a look. We're going to look for this answer. And this is from page 722. A new kind of war. Part of what made World War I so long and deadly was a new technique called trench warfare, defending a position by fighting from the protection of deep ditches. When the French defeated the Germans in the First Battle of the Marne, the Germans did not retreat far. Instead, they dug trenches nearby. Opposite them, the French dug their own trenches. A 400-mile-long network of trenches soon stretched across the Western Front. Now, when they say Western Front, let's make sure we know what that is. This over here is the front line of fighting on the western side of the war. So this is the Western Front. Notice that it doesn't move a whole lot. This is it. All the years of the war, this is the Western Front. The Eastern Front, way over here, take a look. 1914, okay, 1915, 1917, 1918. Look how far that advances. So there's a big change happening here all through the war, but over here, they are stuck. They make very little progress for either side. Soldiers fought in these cold, wet, and muddy ditches, sometimes for months at a time. The filthy trenches were perfect breeding grounds for germs, and soldiers on both sides died from disease. An American in the French army described life in the trenches. The impossibility of the simplest kind of personal cleanliness makes vermin a universal ill, against which there is no remedy. Cold, dirt, discomfort are the ever-present conditions, and the soldier's life comes to mean the most misery that the human organism can support. The empty patch of ground between enemy trenches came to be known as no man's land. This area was quickly stripped of trees and blasted full of holes by artillery shells. Anyone who ventured into no man's land was likely to be killed by enemy fire. Okay, so here are some pictures of what the trenches looked like, and also a diagram that shows you how deep they went. We have a front line of trenches, and then they tunnel back, and there's a whole nother area behind the front line trenches that goes back quite a ways. There's a lot of area in here. And then if you were able to see the diagram continue further, messengers even can come out the back, and there are trenches out the back too. So it's pretty elaborate. This video will show you a little bit more about trenches. It's just about 3 minutes long.
Life in a trench, I'd like to explain in one word: horrific. It's mud, it's death, it's rats, it's stench, and soldiers develop an attitude in a trench that everybody is going to die.
Life in the trench was abysmal. There were several lines of trenches, and the front line trenches, of course, were the most dangerous because they were constantly under fire. Incoming!
The Germans dug assiduously, building dry, safe, and comfortable trenches for themselves, with bunkers that actually had electricity and sometimes running water. The British and French, who were convinced that they were never going to be there for that long, didn't spend nearly the same effort. So their trenches tended to be muddy and wet and not that safe.
Disease ran rampant. It was very difficult to get any sort of sleep, a decent hot meal, keep your clothes dry, and more importantly, to keep your sanity.
There were so many health problems of just simple disease that took much more men out of combat than direct fire.
I think one word that would surprise people about life in a trench: boredom. A lot of time is spent just sitting, cleaning tools, and being scared to death the battle's going to start in a minute.
Was just the day-to-day monotony, being trapped in this very small space and fighting for a war that's really fought in inches.
The idea of open warfare, of fighting out into what they called no man's land, wasn't working. The technology of the war had advanced so much with machine guns, artillery that could lob shells a mile. It became mostly a defensive war early on, and as a defensive war, you wanted to protect your troops, so the miles and miles of trenches were built.
There were often bodies buried in the sides of trenches, bodies lying out in the open in front of the trenches. The soldiers were experiencing not only the war that they were fighting at the moment, but the war that had been going on throughout those trenches for all of the years of the war.
A young lieutenant writes his mother and says, "I haven't been killed yet, but it's only a matter of time." That's typical of the way soldiers felt about life in the trench. You just did it. You existed day to day, tried to go on, keep your chin up, but one day the bullet was going to have your name on it, and you were going to perish. You weren't going home.
Okay, so this is a good time to pause and figure out what trench warfare is. You're going to want to put an answer in that box. You can pause the video if you need to, but don't just copy the book definition for one like this. You're going to want to put a little bit more about what it was like and maybe even why they had to use this warfare. The next piece is going to be weapons used in World War I. Now, there's a lot of ground to cover. If you go to the textbook, it's a couple pages here, but what I've done is I found a video. So we're going to check out weapons of World War I. A lot of the ones from this picture here will be talked about in this video. They'll miss a couple, and we'll come back and talk about those. But here's one more video clip for you, and we'll take a look. This is 2 minutes.
While they may seem primitive now, the weapons of World War I completely revolutionized warfare. Hi, I'm Rebecca Brayton, and welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be exploring the weapons and technology used in the First World War. Mainly, soldiers used bolt-action rifles. These were capable of firing approximately 10 rounds per minute. Machine guns were used by large powers, however, were only useful in stationary battles as they were larger and less mobile. Heavy siege guns, such as Germany's Big Bertha, also were important in the battles of World War I. One of the biggest innovations during World War I was the use of poison gas. In fact, the widespread use of different poisons even had many calling the First World War the Chemists' War. The French were the first to use gas during the war. In August 1914, they used grenades filled with tear gas to combat the Germans. In 1915, the Germans began to use chlorine, the first gas considered lethal. Mustard gas became a significant source of dread for soldiers, as simple exposure to it could burn flesh and cause massive blisters. However, as the use of various gases increased, soldiers became more prepared to confront them. It has been estimated that only about 4% of the deaths in the war can be attributed to gas. The first use of the tank took place during World War I as well. The British and the French led the way in developing tanks, while the Germans focused on anti-tank weapons. Initially, tanks had been brought in as a solution to the stalemate caused by trench warfare on the Western Front. The first appearance on the battlefield was in 1916. The British rushed them into combat, and consequently many were plagued with reliability issues. The heavily bombed-out terrain proved difficult to navigate, and only the most mobile tanks were successful. Nevertheless, the appearance of tanks increased throughout the war as the issues with earlier models were addressed. In the end, British and French tanks played a significant role in the Allied victory.
Okay, so weapons used in World War I. One of the first things that they mentioned was bolt action rifles. So, of course, you're going to want to write that down. They said that was one of the most commonly used. Now, there were a couple of things they did not talk about that are found in this picture over here. U-boats or submarines. The U in U-boat stands for undersea. So yes, they used submarines similar to the one that sank the Lusitania, and you saw that in another video. The other thing they did not mention was airplanes. The beginning of the war, airplanes were not yet set up to have machine guns or bombs or anything like that on them. But within the 4 years of the war, by the end of the war, they were equipped to go in and fight, and they had machine guns hooked up to them, and they dropped bombs on a lot of them on the trenches. So those are two new things that were not mentioned in the video, but I do have some websites in Schoology if you're interested. You do not have to look at those, but if you have a special interest in those, I will set those up for you in Schoology. Okay, next question. What is a stalemate? We need page 723 in the book. This definition is pretty straightforward. There's not a whole lot more you can say. After a year of vicious fighting, the war had become a stalemate, a situation in which neither side can win a decisive victory. So I have a definition for us to this one. And you can feel free to copy this down if you want to pause the screencast and copy it down. You're more than welcome. If you have a different definition, that's fine. This says a situation in a war when neither side is winning or losing and neither side seems to be able to make any progress towards victory. Okay, so feel free to pause and write that down. And the rest of what we're reading is going to tell us about Verdun, the battle. Determined to break the stalemate, both sides launched massive attacks in 1916. In February 1916, the Germans attacked the French city of Verdun at the southern end of the Western Front. That summer, the Allies staged an attack along the Somme River in northeastern France. Both battles raged for months as the armies attacked and counterattacked. By the end of the year, the Germans had failed to take Verdun. At the Somme River, the Allies had advanced just 7 miles. Almost nothing had changed in the Western Front, but nearly 1 million men had been killed at Verdun and the Somme River. As the stalemate on land dragged on, sea battles in the Atlantic Ocean and the North Sea became even more important. The powerful British Navy blockaded the ports of the Central Powers and laid explosive mines in the North Sea. These could blow a huge hole in a ship, sinking it in minutes. The tactic effectively stopped the ships from reaching German ports with needed supplies. Okay, let's take a look at this. They mentioned Somme, the Battle of Somme, and the Battle of Verdun. The video that you watched at the very beginning, the Century video, talked about the Battle of Somme, and they told you about the 1 million men that had died. Now, they combined the two of these because they were happening partly at the same time. The Battle of Verdun starts in February and doesn't end until December. It lasted almost an entire year in 1916. So that's pretty hard to imagine. The Battle of Somme, in order to try to draw some of the Germans from Verdun and focus them up here to help the French, the British attacked the Germans at Somme, and that battle lasted July to November, also quite long. Okay, so let's move on. What happened at Verdun? You can pause here and take a minute to explain what you just learned about that Battle of Verdun, and you can include the Battle of Somme in that too if you want. Okay, this next part is not for today. I am going to help you with this in the next screencast, but this assignment is for tomorrow. If you want to work ahead and do it yourself, you feel absolutely free to do that. Pages 730 to 734 in the book. Fill in the blank just like we've always done, and make sure you use a color other than black to fill your answers in when you do this. Okay, so this is for tomorrow, and I will be back tomorrow to help you find those answers.